All right, hello, and welcome to lesson 3 for Unit 3, Area Study 2, where we're looking at the domestic macroeconomic goals. Previously, we looked at aggregate demand through the 5-sector circular flow model, as well as aggregate supply, and this is all going to build up upon that to try and get you a really good understanding of the first goal that we're going to look at, which is the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, which is all about increasing the amount of production in a country over time. And how we do that is through GDP. So we're going to get straight into our key knowledge here, which is the meaning of the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So that will be defining that goal. You're going to get really good at defining that goal over time because it happens a lot. Whenever you get a question where it says define the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, or it has the goal of strong and sustainable growth in it, you're going to be describing what it is and the parameters for it. We're just going to look at how you measure economic growth using growth in real domestic product, which is real GDP. And we're going to get into how you do that physically, how the math works for that. So our learning intention is to understand the impact of changing economic activity on the domestic macroeconomic goals. And our success criteria today is that you can define the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, and you can outline how economic growth is measured. So for our goal, the definition for our goal is that the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth is to maintain the highest growth rate possible, consistent with strong employment growth, but without running into unacceptable inflationary, external, or environmental pressures. So there's a few really key points here. It's the highest growth rate possible, and it's without running into that unacceptable inflationary, external, or environmental pressures. There, two of the key parts you need. If you need to define this goal, two of the key things that you need within that goal to get full marks for it. And then what we always need in our definition of a goal is what the measurement of that goal is, what the target range is. So in this one, the sustainable rate of economic growth is usually considered to be within 3 to 3.5% real GDP growth per year. So that should be real GDP growth, which is when we take inflation out of GDP growth. And so 3 to 3.5% growth. That means that each year we are growing around 3% of total production compared to the year before, if not more. So as of recording this is in November in 2022, you're probably learning about this in about March of 2023. Our current GDP growth is currently sitting at 3.6%, which is technically outside that goal range, but also at the time that we're at, we've got 7.3% inflation, which means, and that's probably potentially higher by the time that you're in, and that means that inflationary pressure means that the goal is not being achieved. So it's going to be really important with these goals is to be able to say if they are or are not being achieved, and this definitely means that it is not being achieved because of that inflationary pressure. So the government also takes into account international growth rates when analysing the acceptability of our growth rates. And so like I said before, the most current measurement for me is 3.6%, but hopefully when you're studying this, your teacher will have included a more up-to-date measurement, which will hopefully be either within that goal range and potentially inflation will start coming down so this goal can be achieved. So why does the government target 3 to 3.5%? Well, this target is set at a rate to help achieve the government's other objectives, which are the goal of low inflation and the goal of full employment. So if economic growth was less than 3% annually, businesses would see this as a bad thing. So that would mean there's probably falling demand. And so if there's falling demand, businesses will start to lay off excess workers because they want to maintain their profit margins. So unemployment would soon start to rise. And that would mean that there's going to be worse living standards because there's lower income in lower income households, and therefore they're materially and non-materially worse off. And then on the opposite side of things, if growth was consistently larger than 5% per annum, this would create inflationary pressure. Because if we were growing at too fast a rate, we'd be burning through our resources too quickly, which is not sustainable, but also we would run into shortages. And those shortages would put upward pressure on prices, therefore leading to inflation, which is going to make people's income worth less, and we're going to be worse off because of it. So what we really care about in this goal is that it's sustainable growth. That word sustainable is incredibly important in this definition. It's underpinned by 3 important considerations. So growth cannot be so high that it causes inflation to rise. So like we're seeing at the moment, that 7.3% inflation rate is obviously a bad thing. So we want inflation to be within that 2 to 3% on average over time range, which we'll get into in a few lessons time. That it doesn't result in external pressures on the economy. So we do not want our growth to be causing negative external issues. So if it creates an excessive current account deficit, that's going to be a bad thing. That means more money is leaving the country than is coming into it. That's not going to be great in the long term. or if it leads to an overuse of the nation's natural resources. So if we burn through our resources too quickly, it means we're not going to be intertemporally efficient, and it means that future generations are going to suffer. So that is going to be bad for future generations. And obviously, we do not want that. We want our children's children to still have a world that they can live in. So we don't want it to be bad for future generations. And we've seen that a lot with how we used coal, etc. in the past, that we've burned through a lot of our non-renewable resources, and we're starting to get to a point where we need to find more sustainable ways to produce and more sustainable energy and resources, because otherwise the future is going to be relatively screwed. How we measure economic growth. So in Australia, we measure economic growth using annual real GDP growth, and GDP stands for gross domestic product and represents the annual value of all goods and services produced or sold in the nation over a period of time, removing the impact of price increases, which is inflation. We get rid of inflation because otherwise we might say, hypothetically, in year one, produce $100 worth of goods and services. And in year two, we might produce 110. By just knowing that, we can't actually say anything, because if prices increase by 10%, it'd mean we've produced the same quantity of goods and services. So by removing the impact of that inflation, it gives us a more accurate indication of if the value of production actually increased compared to the previous year. And these GDP figures are released each quarter by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and you'll be making sure you keep up to date with them all year long, because they're going to be very beneficial in making your answer stand out if you can use the most current data. So then if you have to calculate real GDP yourself, what you need to do to calculate real GDP is to take inflation that has occurred in the same period away from that. And to do that, we do the following. So to get real GDP, we look at the CPI in the previous period against CPI in the current period, and we times that by current GDP over 1. So in this case, if we had the previous period was 100 for CPI and there was 110, so prices increased by 10%. If GDP was 110, it would mean that we need to do the math there and calculate it. In this, it's always going to be relatively simple math. So although this looks complicated, if you can use some old school fractions, you can work out that 110 and 110 cancel out, and they both become 1. So then it's just 100 times 1 is 100, and 1 times 1 is 1. 100 over 1 equals 1. And so you get a real GDP of 100, because it takes away that 10% price increase. If you are math-minded, sometimes you might be able to see, you might be given all the data and you might not need to do these calculations. This is usually only ever going to be a multiple choice question. Sometimes if you see the CPI data, you might be able to see exactly how much percentage prices have increased. You might then just be able to take that away from GDP in your head and not have to use this math. If you can do that, that is amazing. So because you do not have a calculator for SACs or exams, if you ever have to calculate real GDP, the numbers will be relatively simple enough that you should be able to do it in your head. That's not to say they'll always be whole numbers. VCAR has been sneaky in the past and sometimes made it like 1.8 or 1.9%. As long as you can kind of rationalize where the numbers should be, you should be all right. And that's it for the first lesson for both what the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth is and how to calculate it. So next time we'll be back with the consequences of not achieving the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, where we'll get into everything else about it, good and bad. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment below or email me, Sean@therunningeconomy.com. We'll be, after the goal of strong and stable economic growth, we'll be moving on to the goal of full employment and the goal of low inflation. And then that will be it for this topic. It's a big topic. There's going to be about 10 lessons in total, and then an extra lesson to do on your own, doing research about current aggregate demand, aggregate supply side factors. But other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.